Pompey had every advantage. Caesar had almost nothing, on paper. But something happened at Pharsalus that no one could explain then, and most still don't see now. Why did seasoned legions freeze? Why did victory slip through fingers that had already closed around it? Whatever cracked that battlefield, it wasn't just steel. Forget what you think you know about Marcus Tullius Cicero. The man who could convince Romans that black was white apparently couldn't convince Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompey Magnus to put down their swords. Let's be clear, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, Rome's greatest orator, the same man who talked down conspirators and saved the Republic before, froze like a deer in torchlight. His letters from this period read like someone watching a train wreck in slow motion, knowing they could probably stop it, but paralyzed by indecision. The reality was far uglier than the history books suggest. Here was Rome's most persuasive speaker, and he spent more time deciding which side to back than most people spend choosing breakfast. Support Caesar? He'd be endorsing tyranny. Support Pompey? He'd be betting on yesterday's hero. So Cicero did what politicians do best when faced with impossible choices. He tried to play both sides while actually helping neither. Publicly, he advocated for peace negotiations that everyone knew were pointless. Privately, he leaned toward Pompey, mostly because Pompey represented the old system Cicero had spent his career defending. Anyone telling you Cicero was just being cautious hasn't seen the evidence. Every major player in Rome still listened when he spoke. Caesar respected his opinion. Pompey needed his endorsement. Even Marcus Porcius Cato, the Republic's most stubborn traditionalist, valued Cicero's counsel. But every time someone demanded he pick a side, Cicero suddenly developed a terminal case of diplomatic laryngitis. Frankly, it's astonishing how completely Rome's greatest communicator failed to communicate when it mattered most. The man who could talk his way out of anything talked himself into doing absolutely nothing. When diplomacy stalled, swords replaced speeches, but some swords turned out to be sharper than others. The reality was far uglier than Pompey's impressive army statistics suggest. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus walked into Pharsalus with what looked like Rome's most formidable force on paper. Too bad battles aren't decided by accountants. While Julius Caesar spent a decade turning Gallic warriors into mincemeat and forging his troops into a killing machine, Pompey was making speeches in the forum and collecting honorary titles like a politician at a charity auction. When civil war erupted, Pompey discovered that Senate applause doesn't translate into battlefield competence. Let's be brutally honest about what Pompey actually commanded. 70% of his 47,000 men were either fresh-faced recruits who thought war was glorious or borrowed soldiers whose real loyalty belonged elsewhere. Coordinating this mess was like conducting an orchestra where half the musicians are playing different songs and the other half are tone deaf. Meanwhile, Caesar's legions had been bleeding together for over a decade. They'd faced King Ariovistus and his Germanic hordes at Vosges, crushed Vercingetorix's massive Gallic rebellion at Alesia, and crossed the Rhine and Rubicon, rivers that other armies considered either impassable or politically suicidal. These men didn't just follow orders, they anticipated them. Anyone telling you Pompey's cavalry advantage mattered hasn't grasped the fundamentals. Sure, 7,000 horsemen looked impressive compared to Caesar's measly 1,000, but most had never charged together, never coordinated attacks, and never faced infantry who'd spent years perfecting the art of killing mounted warriors. One can only imagine the sheer desperation of trying to weld borrowed troops into a cohesive fighting force while Caesar's veterans, men from Legio Ex Fretensis and Legio XXX, who'd conquered Gaul together, sharpened their swords. The borrowed soldiers figured they'd rather survive for commanders who actually paid their wages regularly. Bottom line, paper armies look impressive until the paper gets soaked in blood. What really mattered was what neither army could see coming. Forget what Caesar's memoirs tell you about his military genius. The man conveniently forgot to mention how he always seemed to know exactly where Pompey would be and what he planned to do next. Apparently, brilliant intelligence network doesn't sound as heroic as tactical mastery in the history books. Let me tell you what really happened behind the propaganda. Caesar had cultivated sources inside Pompey's inner circle that would make modern spy agencies weep with envy. Roman noble families were interconnected webs of marriages, debts, and political favors. Caesar had spent years collecting IOUs, and civil war was payday. Several senators, including allies of Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus and supporters of Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger, had quietly switched sides. Notable defectors included Gaius Scribonius Curio and even some of Lucius Cornelius Sulla's old supporters. These men fed Caesar detailed intelligence about Pompey's supply lines, troop movements, and private strategic discussions. When you're receiving real-time updates from your enemy's war councils, looking like a strategic mastermind becomes remarkably easy. Caesar also had agents planted among Pompey's quartermasters, the men who handled food, equipment, and logistics. Think about the brutal efficiency. When you know exactly when and where enemy supply convoys will travel, ambushes stop being about military brilliance and become simple mathematics with sharp objects. Anyone telling you Caesar won through pure tactical genius hasn't examined the intelligence war. It's like crediting a poker player's skill while ignoring that he's been reading marked cards all night. But even for an unfiltered historian like myself, it's remarkable how thoroughly Caesar's espionage network has been sanitized from popular history. Speaking of information advantages, if you're finding these blunt truths as fascinating as I am, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, the brutal reality gets even more shocking from here. Sometimes it's not the legions that win wars, it's the leaks. But even perfect intelligence couldn't solve every problem. Forget the dramatic clash of armies you've seen in movies. The real battle at Pharsalus was fought by empty stomachs, dysentery, and the slow psychological breakdown of two supposedly great military minds. Both commanders discovered that you can't eat tactical brilliance and military glory doesn't cure the runs. The reality was far grimmer than any Hollywood epic suggests. For months, Pompey and Caesar played deadly chicken across the plains of Thessaly near Dyrrhachium while their armies slowly rotted from within. Pompey controlled the Egyptian grain supply through Alexandria. Caesar controlled the wealth of Gaul through Gallia Narbonensis. Neither wanted to blink first, so both forces transformed into skeletal, disease-ridden shadows of fighting men. Pompey's strategy was brutally simple: starve Caesar into submission. Unfortunately, the man forgot that borrowed soldiers on empty stomachs tend to remember they have homes to return to, and commanders who actually feed them. Caesar's counter-strategy was equally straightforward. Bait Pompey into attacking before hunger forced a humiliating retreat. But Pompey wasn't stupid enough to assault Caesar's fortified positions just because Caesar wanted him to. The result? Two enormous armies staring at each other across Greek countryside, slowly dying of everything except combat. Let's be clear about the conditions. Dysentery spread through the ranks like wildfire. Clean water became scarce. Proud legionnaires were reduced to boiling leather scraps and chewing grass. Some veterans later claimed they preferred fighting Germanic barbarians to enduring another week of that hellish siege. One can only imagine the sheer desperation of centurions working overtime to prevent mass desertions while hungry soldiers questioned why they were dying for someone else's political ambitions. It makes you wonder how either army retained enough strength to fight at all. The actual battle lasted hours. The waiting nearly destroyed them both. When action finally came, it arrived with a tactical surprise that changed everything. Anyone telling you Caesar was some kind of tactical innovator at Pharsalus hasn't studied his Gallic campaigns. Julius Caesar had a favorite trick, and like most successful commanders, he wasn't remotely embarrassed about recycling what worked. Years earlier in Gaul, Caesar had devastated tribal armies at Bibracte by concealing an extra infantry line behind his cavalry. The maneuver had worked so brilliantly against Vercingetorix's warriors at the siege of Alesia that Caesar decided Roman legions deserved the same unpleasant surprise. Here's the brutal simplicity of it. While Pompey focused on conventional tactical elements, infantry lines, cavalry wings, the predictable Roman battle formation, Caesar quietly positioned his best troops as a hidden fourth line behind his right flank. Pompey's scouts counted Caesar's obvious forces, but completely missed the ones Caesar didn't want them to see. When Pompey's cavalry charged Caesar's right flank, they initially did exactly what cavalry should do. They overran Caesar's horsemen and wheeled around to attack his infantry from behind. For roughly 30 seconds, Pompey's officers probably felt like tactical geniuses. Then Caesar's concealed infantry erupted from hiding and slammed into the surprise cavalry like a sledgehammer hitting eggs. The psychological shock was instantaneous and devastating. Let's be brutally honest. This wasn't innovative military genius. It was successful recycling on an industrial scale. Caesar had used variations of this ambush against the Helvetii at Bibracte, various Germanic tribes across the Rhine, and multiple Gallic coalitions throughout his proconsulship. Each time, enemies who thought they understood Roman tactics discovered they'd been watching the wrong part of the battlefield. But you see, even for an unembellished historian like myself, it's surprising how confidently Caesar reused the same trick. Most generals would hesitate to employ identical tactics twice. Caesar apparently figured, why fix what isn't broken? What devastated tribal warriors worked just as effectively on Rome's finest, but winning the battle was merely the beginning of the real catastrophe. Forget the heroic narratives about honorable defeat. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus's retreat from Pharsalus wasn't just a military disaster, it was a masterclass in destroying your own legend while your men watched. The man called the Great managed to transform a bad day into total career annihilation. When his battle line shattered, Pompey faced the choice every defeated commander confronts: die heroically with your soldiers or live to regroup and fight again. Pompey chose option 3. Flee immediately to somewhere far from angry former allies, accountability, or basic human decency. The reality was far uglier than most accounts suggest. Instead of attempting to rally his scattered forces or organizing even a token fighting retreat, Pompey simply abandoned them. He didn't regroup, didn't inspire, didn't even bother saying farewell to men who'd followed him into disaster. One moment he commanded Rome's army, the next he was sprinting toward the harbor like a debtor fleeing creditors. Anyone telling you this was tactical wisdom hasn't grasped Roman military culture. These soldiers had endured months of starvation, disease, and psychological torment because they believed their commander would share their fate. Pompey's flight told his army that their lives mattered less than his personal survival. Let's be clear about the strategic brilliance of his next move. Pompey sailed to Alexandria, apparently believing that 20-year-old Ptolemy III would welcome him as an honored ally, despite Egypt's long-standing relationship with Rome's grain imports. This demonstrated roughly the same political acumen as asking your rich friend for a loan immediately after losing everything in a poker game. Young Ptolemy's advisors, particularly his unit counselor Pothinus and General Achillas, examined the situation with cold calculation. They decided that dead allies create fewer diplomatic complications than living liabilities. When Pompey's boat reached the shores near Pelusium, they greeted him with smiles, kind words, and an extremely sharp knife. One can only imagine Caesar's frustration when they presented Pompey's severed head as a diplomatic gift. Caesar wept, not from grief, but from sheer exasperation. A clean victory over a worthy opponent would have enhanced his reputation. A butchered rival made him look less like a magnanimous conqueror and more like someone whose enemies mysteriously ended up dead. Battles end on fields, but legacies die in foreign lands. This particular death would poison Roman politics for generations. Forget what you think you know about Caesar's triumph. His victory at Pharsalus didn't just defeat Pompey's army, it shattered the Roman Republic's delicate political ecosystem beyond any hope of repair. Breaking complex systems is easy. Rebuilding them when half the pieces are missing and the rest are soaked in blood? That's considerably more challenging. Let me paint the brutal picture. The old Senate that had guided Rome for centuries was essentially extinct. Death, exile, and political disgrace had eliminated most men who actually understood how the Republic's intricate machinery functioned. Caesar found himself like someone who demolished a house and suddenly realized he needed somewhere to live. The reality was far grimmer than Caesar's propaganda suggested. This wasn't foreign conquest where you install a friendly government and march home victorious. Civil war meant every Roman Caesar killed was someone's father, brother, or son. Every senator he exiled was connected to dozens of other families. Every political alliance he destroyed, from the old Sullan network to Pompey's eastern clients, had required generations to construct. Caesar couldn't restore the old system because it had just tried to execute him, but he couldn't create an entirely new system without triggering another civil war. He was trapped between a republic that no longer functioned and an empire that didn't yet exist. Anyone telling you Caesar planned this outcome hasn't examined the evidence. The man won everything and gained nothing lasting. Sure, he became dictator, but he spent his remaining 4 years constantly checking over his shoulder, wondering which senator would plant the knife in his back. Spoiler alert, they did exactly that. Let's be brutally honest about what Pharsalus actually accomplished. The Republic had always depended on unwritten rules and mutual respect among the elite. Pharsalus proved that some Romans would rather burn down the entire system than share power. Frankly, even for an unvarnished historian like myself, it's remarkable how thoroughly one battle on the plains near Pharsalus destroyed centuries of political evolution. The civil wars following Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March proved that Romans had learned political problems could be solved with swords. Once that lesson is absorbed, it becomes remarkably difficult to unlearn. Gaius Octavius Augustus eventually brought peace after the Battle of Actium, but only by admitting the Republic was dead and constructing an empire on its grave. Rome didn't collapse in a single day, but Pharsalus was when it lost its center. Sometimes winning is just losing more slowly. So what do you think was the biggest factor in Caesar's victory at Pharsalus? Was it his spy network feeding him intelligence, Pompey's catastrophic army composition, or that brilliant hidden fourth-line tactic? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious which factor you think was most decisive. Remember to subscribe, because next week we're uncovering another brutal truth about Roman power that most people get completely wrong. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.